November 2004 was a damn fine month to be a fan of first-person shooters. Halo 2 graced the Xbox and Half-Life 2 revolutionised PC gaming. 2004 in general was a stacked year for games, too many to even list. I would risk saying it's the best year for games of all time. Just the sheer amount of quality titles, especially in the FPS department. But the PS2 wasn't sharing in the success as much as Xbox and PC were though. What they needed was a first-person shooter that could compete with the likes of Halo. A Halo killer, you could say. We're talking about Killzone. I was gonna talk about Halo 2, but what is there to say that hasn't already been said? It's one of the best FPS games ever made. Great story and online multiplayer that games struggle to even compete with now. Perhaps it stumbles in a couple areas where they try some new things, particularly the unrefined nature of the brute enemies found later in the game. Doesn't matter, Halo 2 is one of my favourite games ever. So, how can Killzone even hope to compare? Developed by Dutch studio Guerrilla Games, Killzone began life as a generic sci-fi shooter until taking on new life as a sci-fi game that would be heavily, and I mean heavily, influenced by the Second World War. Killzone centres around the second extrasolar war between the planets Vecta and Helghast. There's a lot of lore here that's actually pretty interesting. I love a good sci-fi world to get lost in, and the story of Killzone tells the tale of an epic space opera. Sadly, this doesn't shine through into the actual meat and bones of the game. The opening cutscene sets the scene perfectly. There isn't an opening crawl, but the sharply written dialogue performed by Brian Cox tells us everything we need to know about the oncoming conflict. It also serves as a perfect introduction to the game's antagonists, the Helghast. We learn that the Helghast were banished from Vecta decades ago, the harsh conditions of their new home causing them to mutate in order to adapt, the living conditions breaking the people and allowing a fascist dictatorship to rise from the ashes and ensure that they will have their revenge. They will reclaim the planet they were forced off. The rest of the game fails to live up to this introduction. There isn't any world building scattered throughout the campaign, which is a shame considering there was a fair bit in the marketing, and even the manual is stylized as though it came straight out of the Killzone universe, full of lore tidbits and humorous fictionalized product placements. It feels like a true missed opportunity that the lore doesn't come to anything meaningful. The Helghast can be portrayed as sympathetic, which is slightly hard to believe considering they're space Nazis, and well, they're called the Helghast. They may as well have called them the Bastard Evils. But the conflict is morally grey, just like the game's colour palette. The story is quite pathetic. Intended to be a gritty war movie, Killzone has more in common with something like G.I. Joe. An army of bland and unlikable characters coupled with lame dialogue makes for a real slog of a story. It doesn't help that the cutscenes are rough to look at. They've been smeared with so many filters, it looks as though you're playing through the game in a drunken haze. And they severely waste both Brian Cox and Ronnie Cox here too. That's a lot of Cox. Brian Cox only appears in the opening. Only his character's name, Scholar Visari, is uttered by the supporting cast. I understand that Brian Cox would have been pretty expensive, but they could have at least got him to do some additional lines that could have been dispersed throughout the game. Instead, the story pivots to General Adams, voiced by Ronnie Cox, a Vectan that's sympathetic to the Helghast cause. Gutted that this character is so bland, Adams isn't remotely sympathetic. He's a psychopathic murderer. Yet again, the complex world of Killzone is denied entry into this game. I don't typically care about story in video games, but you'd think that because Guerrilla had put so much time and effort into crafting an interesting sci-fi landscape, that they'd think to include it in the game it was made for. The gameplay doesn't fare much better. The player is given the option to play as 4 different characters, which are unlocked as you progress. Templar, a captain in the ISA, Luger, a Black Ops assassin, Rico, a heavy weapons specialist, and Colonel Haka, a Helghast defector working as a spy for the ISA. He's also voiced by Sean Pertwee, and unlike Brian and Ronnie, he isn't totally wasted in the narrative. These characters have a few unique abilities that set them apart, but you'll want to stick with Rico as he can stomach the most damage and is equipped with a chain gun which has a plentiful supply of ammunition. Plus, it doesn't need reloading. Combat itself is a mixed bag. There isn't any aim assist, which is a pretty bold move for a console shooter. Even bolder, considering the game has a frame rate as smooth as Doom on the Super Nintendo. It gets harder to play the further in you get. The environments in the latter portion of the game are these big, wide open spaces with fog so dense that it gives me flashbacks to games in the N64. These environments also murder the frame rate. Compared to the early game missions, they pale in comparison. The beginning of the game consists of war-torn cityscapes and industrial districts. Encounters with the Helghast invaders are, for the most part, close quarters here, meaning the frame rate is stable and you won't have as much difficulty aiming. The best combat sequences are found inside buildings and spaceships, not the outdoor locations that Killzone spends a majority of its time in. This allows the game's combat to shine through, and it's actually pretty fun. Not as good as Halo or the many other FPS games floating around in Killzone's orbit, but solid enough that you'll actually enjoy what you're doing. Although explosives are oddly ineffective, weapons are punchy, and the design of the Helghast infantry works well. The image of their silhouettes marching out of the smoke is somewhat striking, the only visible part of their bodies being their angry red eyes. Graphically, Killzone is a tad head-mincing. Character, weapon, and vehicle models look amazing, almost the same quality as an early PS3 game. Levels, on the other hand, range from reasonably impressive to impressively putrid. As usual, the indoor environments have aged better. They aren't lit as flatly as the multiple beaches and jungles you'll be traversing. The game was marketed as a true graphical powerhouse in 2004. Specific elements are indeed impressive, but the abundance of ugly post-processing effects make the game even harder to look at than it already is. The AI isn't particularly bright either, often taking their sweet time in noticing that you're standing just a few meters away. There are so many concessions made that the game isn't technically impressive. All the compromises make for a lesser experience. In what I can only assume to be a limitation of the engine or the hardware, music does not play during gameplay. I'd argue this is the game's biggest flaw, as the music is epic. You can hear it play in the background of all the cutscenes in the opening, but never while you're playing. Killzone doesn't have any ambience or atmosphere because of this. The final battle with General Adams is laughably mundane. I didn't even realize I was about to beat the game, as it was simply treated like business as usual. And that's all I have to say about Killzone. It's quite disappointing. There's a lot of squandered potential concerning the plot, and the gameplay can be fun, but it's let down by some poor level design. I want to like it, I really do, it's right up my street, but I just can't, and I feel terrible for it. There's just so many great ideas, but the quality just isn't there. There was a HD remaster in 2012 that improved the performance and provided clearer visuals. This is the best way to play the game without a doubt. I actually enjoyed my time with it, mostly. Not much they could do about the janky gameplay and bland level design. Sadly, the physical version fetches some of the most ludicrous prices I've ever seen for a 7th generation game. It isn't even worth it. Killzone is not worth over £100. Luckily, the digital version is still available on the PlayStation Store on the PS3, so you might want to snap it up before Sony inevitably decides to erase it from existence. So, Killzone, not up to much. But, Killzone 2? Killzone 2 is awesome. Pretty much a refined version of the first game, this time taking place on the Helghast homeworld. Killzone 2 is one of my favourite FPS games. Definitely my favourite PS3 exclusive. Graphically, it has aged like wine. The intense usage of post-processing effects giving it a highly stylized appearance. It's one of those cinematic games where I think that boosting it up from 30 frames to 60 would cause the cinematic and intentionally heavy and sluggish feel of the game to be lost, though a remaster would still be appreciated. It's a wholly unique game, not many other games like it. The final gauntlet of enemies is pandemonium, and it's what finally swayed me over to the PS3, dethroning the 360 as my go-to 7th gen console. I like Killzone 2 so much that I got the Steelbook and the Japanese release, because who's gonna stop me? Taxman? My arch enemy John Taxman? I know you've been reading my letters. They're not for you, they're for me! Anyway, where was I? Oh yeah, Killzone 3. I don't care for Killzone 3. Everything I liked about the second game was thrown out the window, replaced by something that looks and plays like other shooters. The gritty and analog feel of the second game is mostly absent. The difficulty is insane. Enemies are as strong as they were in the prior game, but it's as though you're made out of styrofoam. And the save system is garbage. Malcolm McDowell is good in it though.
But sir, the men... Fuck 'em.
And this brings us to the last mainline Killzone entry, excluding a couple of handhelds. Killzone Shadowfall. Not a lot to say here. I couldn't even bother my arse to finish this game. Virtually all the elements that make up Killzone's iconography is gone. The art direction is far more reminiscent of Horizon, Guerrilla's current franchise. Grit and grunge replaced by clean surfaces and holograms. God, I hate holograms. I won't deny that it does look great from a graphical standpoint, with Shadowfall serving as a launch title for the PS4. That was 11 years ago. The passage of time is scary. Shadowfall is currently the last Killzone game, the franchise seemingly dead. I know the world is getting a bit sick of the current remake craze, but I actually think Killzone might benefit from that kind of treatment. The PS2 was clearly ill-equipped to handle what Guerrilla was aiming to achieve, whereas the PlayStation 5 probably is. Perhaps all of the magazines and online publications touting Killzone as a Halo killer is ultimately what doomed the franchise. Edge even simply asking whether the game was Halo for the PS2. Few judged the game on its own merits. Guerrilla never intended to kill Halo, they simply wanted to make a sci-fi first-person shooter that took a great deal of inspiration from the Second World War. Seems a shame that most people only remember Killzone for that fact, that it was a Halo killer. Ah well, happy birthday Killzone, and remember, glory to Helghast.